show some of the statistics that my team handles every single year. Again, we support the vast majority of SUNY campuses, not all. So for those that aren't familiar with the SUNY Online Help Desk, and they are SUNY campus, if you're interested in taking our services, feel free to reach out to me or Dan, and we'd be glad to kind of talk to you about it. I would be remiss if I didn't kind of shout out a couple of my team members that actually did make it here. So Lori Palmer and Rose Bordet are in the back. Lori's actually been on the help desk for 25 plus years. So shout out to her for all these years. I told her years ago, so we're based out in Albany. I told her years ago the number of contacts that she's handled, whether it's phone calls or web requests, etc. She's basically handled the city of Albany at least, right? That's about 100,000 people in the city of Albany. She's pretty much talked to everybody at some point over the course of these 25 years. So, and Rose has been with us for almost 3 years. So again, we have a very diverse, very good crew, as most of you know. I do have the pleasure, again, of introducing Megan Cole. I will not read their whole bio, so I know you're here, and I'm sure most of you have read it, but I do want to kind of go over a little bit about, just so for those that are online that maybe have not had a chance to read it. Megan is a professor and learning designer with the Dutton Institute for Teaching and Learning Excellence, supporting the Pennsylvania State College of Earth Minerals and Sciences. She has been recognized for innovative teaching practices with the 2021 Marion G. Mitchell Award for Innovative Teaching. Megan has held key leadership roles with OLC's Accelerate Conference and has contributed to the EDUCAUSE's Courseware Advisory Board initiative supported by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Megan's research, funded by the Schreier Institute of Scholarship, focuses on supporting neurodivergent learners in higher education, which is what she's here to talk about today. So again, it's something that, Alex does a great job of, bringing people here to talk about various different topics. I'm always look forward to hearing about stuff that I don't usually hear about at the help desk. So hopefully you enjoy Megan's session as well. And if you have any questions about the help desk, I'm around.
Okay.
Yeah.
In order for you all to be able to see the presentation, it unfortunately means that I can't see any of my notes. So we're going to make this work a different way. And that's what we do, right? When things go wrong, we adapt. All right, so hello everyone, and thank you, Mike, for that wonderful introduction. I really appreciate it. And I wanted to say thank you so much for having me here today. I know it's typically customary for a speaker to say thank you, but I just have to say that every single person that I've met here thus far has just given me the kindest, warmest, most welcoming greeting I think that I've ever received at a conference. So thank you. And I think that that just speaks to the caliber of the people that are here today. And thank you also to the individuals who are joining us online. Now, as I go through my presentation today, the slides are largely visual. There's not a lot of text on them, but there are some screens that we'll get to in which there are important graphics. And once we get to those, I will be describing those in detail for anybody who might need that type of visual support. So just keep that in mind. So I'd like to start our conversation off by redefining our understanding of neurodiversity. And the reason why I think that we need to do that is for three primary reasons. One is because people have a tendency of looking at the conditions rather than thinking holistically about the individual learner and the way that we need to be going about supporting those individual learners. We need to be meeting them where they are rather than focusing just on their differences. I also believe that not viewing neurodivergent learners as a group of others. And that's also something that I'm hearing in the conversations that are occurring today. Oh, we need to accommodate those groups of people. And that's not the types of conversations that we need to be having. We need to be thinking about all of us as an inclusive group together. And then lastly, I think we need to think about redefining our understanding of neurodiversity because I believe that there are many disconnects in the conversations that we are having on this topic. What we think neurodivergent learners need might not actually be what we're providing for them for. Okay. So in order to help us understand this, I wanted to provide you with a bit of an example. And I was a little hesitant to discuss ADHD on this realm because everybody gravitates to either autism or ADHD when we start talking about neurodiversity. And there's many more conditions that need to be taken into consideration. However, I think ADHD serves as a really good example of how you can have a single condition with multiple different characteristics that are associated with it and multiple different diagnoses. So for example, you see here on the screen, when a person is diagnosed with ADHD, they can have one of three primary diagnoses: inattentive, hyperactive impulsive, or combined type. And as I'm going to different presentations and hearing other people talk about neurodiversity, what I'm hearing as part of this conversation is that people are zeroing in on the attention deficit, and they're focusing on how to accommodate students with the inattentive diagnoses. And what's happening is the hyperactive and the combined type are being completely overlooked. Now, what this is perpetuating are stereotypes, and we need to be cognizant of that. Actually bring this up here a little bit so I can see it better. And so one of the recommendations that I hear a lot of people making around supporting individuals with inattentive ADHD is this notion of giving lots of breaks, right? Every single presentation that I've heard somebody talk about ADHD, it's give students lots of breaks because that's going to help them be able to focus better. And actually, if you take a look at the research does not support that. In fact, the research has identified that giving lots of non-pedagogically rational breaks does not support the ADHD learners in your classrooms. It provides a very minimal benefit, but there's many more interventions that are actually much more effective. And so what they're doing in these dynamics is they are taking the condition-specific approach first. And that's not the way we need to be addressing this, because the condition-specific approach is ineffective. We're not trying to support a condition, we're trying to support a human being. And as we know, humans are complex and they are messy and they can be confusing. And so that's why we need to think differently about how we view neurodiversity overall. So we are all neurodivergent, if you think about it. And here's how I'm going to demonstrate that. I want you to turn and look to the people around you. Go ahead. Do you see anyone in this room who looks exactly like you? Now, okay, so I see two very similar gentlemen in the back of the room who are stroking their beards. But even still, if you turn around and look at those two gentlemen, you will notice that their beards are not identical. Their beards are slightly different lengths. And there's just a slightly different shape and maybe some different shading in there too. But that sort of reinforces the point that I want to make. And it's this: if we can experience such differences externally, doesn't it make sense that we would have the same degree of variance cognitively? And so that's what I want you to keep in mind when we think about understanding neurodiversity. And actually, I want to read you a quote from a research study. It's titled "Neurodiversity in Higher Education, a Narrative Synthesis." And the quote is this: "Use of the term neurodiversity focuses on differences in individual brain function and behavioral traits, regarded as part of normal variation in the population. Terms such as atypical developmental pathways can be challenged by the stance that there is no typical mental capacity, no normal brain to which all other brains are compared. Neurodiversity simply means being wired in a different way rather than wrongly." And so this, as you can see, sort of sets us up for the next point that we want to explore, which is the fact that the supports that we think our learners need might not actually be the ones that we need. So as you can see here on the screen, there's a screenshot of a research study, and it's titled "Neurotypical Peers Are Less Willing to Interact with Those with Autism Based on Thin Slice Judgments." So the interesting thing about this research study is that they provided artifacts that had been created by individuals with autism, and they provided them to our neurotypical counterparts. And it was really interesting because when a neurotypical individual was provided with a piece of written content from an individual with autism, they didn't notice. They didn't notice anything that was different. When they were provided with video or audio files, there was something different about the pacing or the visuals and the nonverbal cues within those two types of media in which the neurotypicals were able to distinguish as something that was other. And when those neurotypical individuals were asked if they would ever engage with those individuals in person, the answer was no. I want to let that sink in for a minute. Because one of the things that we are doing is we are focusing so heavily on trying to support the conditions that we are overlooking, as I said, that human component. And part of being human is being accepted. And so what we need to do is we need to think about supporting our neurodivergent learners from a holistic perspective, not just academically, but from a place of personal belonging as well. And so in order to help us do that, I've created a framework. And I'm really excited to share this framework with all of you, but there's something that I really want you to keep in mind as we explore this. This is not designed to be a checklist. A lot of times nowadays, there are so many people looking for quick fixes, and they want the checklists because if they know that they've checked every single item off on the checklist, then they're good to go. But as I said before, we're human and we're humans and we're messy and confusing. And you can't put a human being in a box. You can't put a human, or you can't put a checklist on a human being. It just doesn't work that way. So this is the framework that I would like to share to you. And I'm going to take a moment to just walk through this visually so that we provide, appropriate accommodations for individuals. So what's being displayed on the screen is a parallelogram. And there's 3 levels or 3 layers to this parallelogram. And there's 2 gray bars that run horizontally down through the center of this. In the lower left portion, we have the words executive function. In the middle layer on the left, we have the word accessibility. And then on the top layer, we have condition specific. Then the first gray bar to the left that separates the parallelogram, we have the term systemic barriers. Now those 4 terms, and I realize that the Zoom bar is sitting over top of the text that's above that, but above that we have the title learner support. And so these are the areas that we should be focusing on in order to provide appropriate academic support for our learners. Then the other gray bar that you see sort of creates a transition point, if you will, in this visual. And that's labeled hidden curriculum. Then in the lower right portion of the parallelogram, we have the word validation. Above that is receptiveness. And then the portion sitting on the top is titled acceptance. Now, those 4 areas relate to our sense of personal belonging. Let's go ahead and take a closer look at this. Now, if you have done any research on neurodiversity, you have probably come across the term executive functions at some point. At a bare minimum, you've probably come across terms like working memory. And so what we need to keep in mind is that when we think of neurodivergent learners, we tend to think of those differences. We tend to think of those condition-specific things, like the student who has difficulty focusing or the student who has trouble sitting for long periods of time. But the reality is that the executive functions are kind of like the iceberg, and they're the portion that sits underneath the water. They're the things that we don't necessarily see, but yet they need support as well. And the condition specific are the portions that sit, they're the piece of the iceberg that we typically see, right? Now, the executive functions should be the foundation of our support for neurodivergent learners. And the executive functions are really important because they not only help us academically, but they help us in our daily lives. Now, if you talk to a psychologist, or rather several psychologists, you will get varying opinions on how many executive functions there actually are. Some people claim there are 3. Other people claim there are as many as 33. I personally like to go with this model that was established in the research article, Executive Skills, the Hidden Curriculum by Pam Dawson and Richard Guare. And the reason why I like this model in particular is because there are 11 components to it. And the way that these components are classified is they make it something that is approachable and is understandable for even someone who is not very familiar with neurodiversity. And I think that that's important when we think about trying to help other people understand neurodiversity and how to go about supporting them. We need something that's approachable, but it's not only 3 components, and 3 components just doesn't feel sufficient. And I'd also like to take a moment to point out that if you look at anything that's happening in K through 12 regarding neurodiversity and support for neurodivergent learners, you'll notice something very interesting. In the classroom, they provide accommodations for the condition-specific needs. But when you look at support programs dedicated to helping the neurodivergent learners, they focus on interventions and remediations, and they focus on the executive functions. So what we need to do as educators is we need to wrap this into the process and provide appropriate support for them. And one of the reasons for that is because Dr. Russell Barkley, who, if any of you have been on YouTube or looked at different YouTube videos about neurodiversity to see what people are saying. Dr. Russell Barkley has a channel, and it is wonderful. He really takes a lot of the research and he dives down into the details and helps it become more understandable for people. But he specializes in supporting ADHD. And one of the things that he communicates to people about ADHD is that the executive functioning, it's almost like we have a battery, right? So our battery is kind of full at the beginning of the day. And every time we encounter something that requires those executive functions, our battery gets drained a little bit, right? So it's very similar to our cell phones, right? The more phone calls you make, the more you use that cell phone, the more the battery drains. And so that's why it's important for us to keep these in mind when we are designing our educational experiences, because what happens is our learners are being taxed, or their battery is being drained by just figuring out how to engage with some of the materials that we're putting in front of them. And they're not actually having the opportunity to fully participate in the learning experiences because they're just trying to figure out how to navigate if they don't have several of these executive functioning skills. So we're going to move on to the notion of accessibility. Now, I know that there was a phenomenal workshop that was given here yesterday about accessibility. I've heard nothing but rave reviews, and I'm actually not going to talk about that heavily for several reasons. One is because I feel like there's nothing else I could say in addition to what was covered in the workshop. But also, one of the things that I want to say about accessibility is that I prefer to direct people to the POUR principles, which comes to us from WCAG. I know there's a lot of people who are really passionate about UDL. We can have a conversation about UDL some other time. UDL is a really great tool, but when we're talking about accessibility, I personally recommend that people go back to the WCAG and the POUR principles. And if you're not familiar with them, they're perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Now, even though they were designed primarily for web content accessibility, they translate into the classroom really well. And a great example of that is providing text alternatives, which is one of the recommendations under perceivable. So when we think about how our students are engaging in our online dynamics, it makes sense that individuals might need a screen reader. So providing them with text alternatives or other resources in order to be able to navigate those the information that's being provided to them. We can see a similar dynamic in the classroom, right? So we have note takers, or you can provide your students with copies of your slides or even worksheets or handouts that can capture that information and provide it to them in an alternate format. And so now I want to move on to the notion of condition specific. And so if you remember from the visual, that was that uppermost portion on the right-hand side. And I want to talk more so about condition-specific support, because when we address the executive functions, we're essentially addressing the cognitive needs of our learners. When we talk about accessibility, we're addressing more of the physical needs. And so when we get to condition-specific, this is really where we need to start zeroing in on the individual. And as I mentioned before, there's a lot of people who are approaching this from condition-specific first, and we need to think about condition-specific as an alternate way of saying customization based on individual needs. And when we approach condition-specific needs, we not only need to focus on some of the challenges that may arise, and you'll see here I've got several listed, such as hyperfocus, sensory concerns, and emotional regulation. But say, for example, we have a student in our classroom who has sensory concerns. And that's not something that we necessarily planned for, because what we were planning is group activities. But we happen to be in a space that's very cavernous, and the sound echoes very strongly. And so it becomes a barrier for that student. That's not something that we could have necessarily known, because how are we supposed to know that that individual has sensory issues without communicating with them? Maybe there's accommodations letters that come through. We'll get to that in a few moments. But the point is that you have to pay attention, and you have to be observing what's going on in your classroom, and you have to be meeting your students where they are. So that if you see that a student is struggling with those sensory concerns in that group dynamic, you can work with them to provide appropriate remediations. We also need to think about the strengths. And as I mentioned before, this is a part of the conversation that's really being left out. We spend so much time focusing on trying to address the challenges and to level the playing field that we're not spending a lot of time focusing on the neurodivergent learners and helping them to see the talents and the abilities that they have that are unique to them. And this is the perfect opportunity for us to be doing that. And neurodivergent learners are not taught to advocate for themselves. So that's another reason that reinforces the notion that we need to be observing and paying attention so that we can see that student and say, hey, did you know that you have an incredible ability to observe things around you? You can see details that I noticed that your other peers don't pick up on. And being one of the individuals who received feedback such as, what are you talking about, Megan? None of this makes sense. I don't understand where you're going with this. I was always a person who could jump to the end goal so much faster than my peers could. And I faced a lot of rejection because of that, because they couldn't follow the pathway as quickly as I could. And so being able to tell a student that they have that as a strength, when in fact their peers are making them feel as though it's a deficit or a difference that makes them feel other. This is a great opportunity for us to reframe that for them and to help them see their unique talents and abilities. And if we can do this, we're not just helping to shore up some of those differences, but we're enabling them to take those strengths and to move them forward and to help them see something unique and amazing about themselves. Okay. Let's talk about systemic barriers. Now, this is based off of a research study that I did with a colleague of mine, and we interviewed numerous students and did surveys. And even though we have quite a few items up here on the screen under accommodations, stigmatization, and faculty training, I still believe that this isn't a comprehensive list. I still believe that there are many things that we haven't captured in this. But very quickly, under accommodations, we have things like financial burdens. If you're not familiar with the process to actually get a formal evaluation for a diagnosis, it can be extremely expensive, and most insurance companies do not cover it. In addition, complex systems. Did you know that in some institutions, a student needs a formal recommendation? They can get temporary recommendations, but those temporary recommendations are only good for one semester. And then after that, the support drops away if they don't have that formal diagnosis. Following the pandemic, there was easily a 9 to 15 month wait just to get an initial consultation. So that means that there were students who were going through our educational systems and they were not getting the support that they needed simply because they didn't have that formal diagnosis. And in addition to that, there's things like loss of privacy. Under stigmatization, we have things such as students feeling singled out, or there being exclusive policies regarding the support for neurodivergent learners, and also a sense of loss regarding social engagement. Students said repeatedly in this study that they felt as though they were always disconnected from their peers, and their peers didn't fully accept them for who they were. And again, that just goes to reinforce our notion that we need to be supporting the whole learner. And then there's also the concept of faculty training. Now, in this research study, very sadly, many students reported that they did not receive a great deal of compassion or understanding from the faculty when they approached them for accommodations. And students found that typically the faculty members who were willing to provide accommodations were the ones who either were neurodivergent themselves or had a family member or knew someone who had this a condition similar to their own. And so that also reinforces that last point there, which is the need for formal training for our faculty. Now, we're getting there. There are lots of resources and support and trainings that are being developed, but it's a long process. All right, now we're going to shift over to the other side of the parallelogram, and we're going to talk about the hidden curriculum. So out of curiosity, how many people are familiar with the notion of the hidden curriculum? Not many people. Okay, we've got a couple of people online. Okay, but just a few. All right, so I wasn't planning on diving too deeply into this, but I'll give a high-level overview. So the concept of the hidden curriculum is something that was developed by Philip Jackson in the 1960s. And the hidden curriculum, you can see I've got sort of some primary principles listed up here on the screen. Values, norms, beliefs, procedures, regulations, and expectations. These are all things that are part of the hidden curriculum. And basically what he believed is that all of these concepts that you see on the screen ended up coming or being brought into education from society, and they end up influencing the interpersonal dynamics that we have. And when we're talking about the hidden curriculum, what we're actually talking about is a message, an underlying message that some people can pick up on. And if you can, then you can much more easily navigate the dynamics. If you cannot interpret that implicit messaging, you're going to struggle much more significantly. And so what I'd like to do here for a moment is I realize that this is kind of a newer concept that I'm introducing to you, but we have some the components listed up here. I would like you all to turn to one another and just very briefly talk about this idea of the hidden curriculum. And actually, Alex, can I use the example that you and I spoke about previously? Okay. So when Alex and I were talking, when she first invited me to come and speak, one of the things that she had shared with me when we were talking about the hidden curriculum was the fact that when she was going for her PhD program, one of the hidden curriculum that she became aware of during that process was the fact that when you are writing a journal article for publication, one of the things that you want to do is you want to reference journals from that same publication. Journals like to see their works promoted again and again. That was a lesson of the hidden curriculum that she learned. And so I'd like you all to turn to one another and just engage briefly in a conversation. We'll just give us a few minutes, maybe 2 minutes, and see what types of things you think might be part of the hidden curriculum. And for those that are joining us online, you're welcome to go ahead and share your ideas in the chat window, and I'll go ahead and take a look at those. Yes, Loretta. So what I'd like you to do is take a look at these lists of the hidden curriculum here on the side of the screen, the values, norms, beliefs, procedures, regulations, and expectations, and try to identify an example or an instance in which you have experienced the hidden curriculum in some way. Yeah. All right, let's go ahead and circle back. We're going to reconvene. So, and I believe Mike has the mic. So if you have a thought that you'd like to share, raise your hand and Mike's got you. So what are some things that you talked about in your group that you believe are a part of the hidden curriculum? And if you want, I can read some of the ones that people have posted online in order to sort of prime the pump, because there's some really good ones. Let's go ahead. Let's do that. Let's start. Okay, so some include how dates are formatted. So if you have international students, they might struggle with the formatting of the dates. Yes, absolutely. Interacting with students and faculty from other cultures, for example, using a lot of slang, which can be confusing for them. How to navigate an LMS. Power structures in the classroom. Yeah, these are great. What W means for financial aid. I don't think I even know what W means for financial aid. Navigating the system, especially for first gen. Yes, absolutely. Understanding what to do if you're on your way to a bad grade. The admin cycle of drop with refund dates. Yes. Subtle cultural things like how to close or how close do you stand to people or what eye contact is expected. Yes. Struggling with not wanting to overhelp in this area because the struggle can assist with learning, but I can see how they need support. Yeah, absolutely. Group dynamics. The assumption that students are coming into programs with study skills. Oh, Steve, fantastic. You actually took one of my next talking points. So two really important components of the hidden curriculum that I haven't seen identified yet is one, study skills, because these are not things that are being taught to our learners. Can anybody guess what the other one is? Learning. No one has taught our students how to learn. We've taught our students how to memorize information and repeat it back for the test. We're not teaching our students how to learn. Now we're trying. There are many faculty who are doing amazing things with their students, but at what point have we ever paused and explained the learning process to these learners? Bueller, right? So there are many different things that we can do. And actually, I want to read a quote from my notes here. See, this is why I needed my notes. And it's this. No one has ever taught students how to learn. This may be the most prominent aspect of the hidden curriculum, but also the most overlooked one. Now, I'm sure if this were a workshop, a multi-hour workshop, we'd have lots of time to dig into different ways that we could go about doing that. Video tutorials, job aids, all sorts of different opportunities to help the students learn that process and also how to study. But there's also more simplistic ways that we can do that. We can work it right into the instructions, right? So if you give a student an assignment, like, if you want to work with this information, if you want to learn to dive deeper within this, give them additional activities, not just the one homework assignment, but they'll also explain to them what that process is, or even have them do like a reflective activity so that they can think about their learning, the metacognition, right? One of the executive functions. Okay. Oops. There we go. We're going to move forward onto our next concept, which is validation. So if you remember within the framework that I showed you, we've sort of worked up the left-hand side of the column, and we've addressed our systemic barriers as well as our hidden curriculum. And so now we're starting at the lower portion again. And so validation parallels our executive functions. Now, if you recall, this side of the framework is dedicated to personal belonging. And so we talked about the battery, if you'll also remember that. And when we reduce the cognitive load for a person so that they don't need to expend so many resources on trying to function, they can then focus on engaging. And that's what we want in our classrooms, right? That's what we want from those learning experiences, because we know how valuable the engagement piece can be as part of that learning process. And so when we remove those barriers for the executive functions, we also open the door to social emotional learning. Now, social emotional learning, I want to read you a statement really quickly. And this is from a research article titled "The Assessment of Executive Function and Social Emotional Learning Among Adolescents." Now, this research study was done on students in middle school, but you can see the trends of how that can translate easily into higher education. So the quote is this: "The studies also reported that it is necessary to have relevant skills in order to be successful, not only in school, but also in other areas over the lifespan. The results of the studies showed that SEL skills, social emotional learning skills, increased the academic success of the students, making the classroom school climate more interesting, and contributed to the development of skills such as cooperation, creativity, communication, and critical thinking." Now, here's something interesting that can be observed with the executive functioning skills and social emotional learning. They have found that students, as we just mentioned, students who have strong executive function skills will do really well academically, right? But one of the ways that you can build those executive functioning skills is through the social emotional interactions. So what we need to do is we need to create a loop. We need to create a cycle. But how do we do that when we already know that our neurodivergent learners are not being included by our neurotypicals, those thin slice judgments? So our starting point can be the executive functions. Let's break the barriers down there so that we can create an entry point in, right? So then once our neurodivergent students are spending less time trying to figure out how to navigate the academic environment, they can work on those socialization skills. And then the idea is that that will just become a continuous loop, and they'll continue to develop in both of those areas. Okay, recognition. Now, when we talk about things like screen readers and additional accommodations for students with regard to accessibility, one of the things that we need to be doing as educators is we need to be normalizing the use of those tools and resources. And in doing so, we can actually help break down the social barriers. So, and I know I keep referencing screen readers. It's just, it's a simple one that I know that most people are very familiar with, but there are many other supports. I mean, we've got transcripts, we've got closed captionings, the way that PowerPoint presentations are formatted, and there's many different things that go into that accommodations process. So please don't misunderstand me. I'm not trying to oversimplify it. I'm just using that as an example. So when we encourage students to use things like transcripts and closed captions, even if they're not neurodivergent, and even if they don't necessarily need them, but we can show how they can be leveraged in other ways, then we're going about normalizing the use of those resources. And if we do that, we will provide greater recognition to our neurodivergent learners that they're not a group of others, but they are part of this group, they're part of our community. And then we can actually put them in a position where they can be sharing tools and techniques and strategies that they have for navigating different types of content with their peers, and then thereby hopefully increasing those personal relationships that they can have. All right, we move on to acceptance. So acceptance is our last sort of portion of that framework that I proposed to you all. Now, I want to share a thought, or rather a statement, that a friend had shared with me several years ago. He said, "Megan, none of us are ever truly accepted." And it took me a couple minutes to think about what he was saying, but to some degree, I agree with him. And the reason for that is because we ourselves can't even fully accept ourselves, can we? Think about those really bad days that we have, right? We spill our coffee. Maybe we accidentally drop the leash and the dog runs off, and then we have to go chasing down the dog, and we come back and we're covered with mud and we have to go change, and it's just the day is just filled with chaos. And what do? We berate ourselves. "I'm so stupid. I spilled my coffee again. I can't believe this. What's wrong with me?" Right? That's the inner dialogue that we have. Now, granted, I understand there is no perfect utopia with sunshine and rainbows and unicorns dancing around. But I do believe that we can reach a certain degree of acceptance. And I believe that the qualities of that acceptance are as follows. We can create an environment for neurodivergent learners where they have personal support from their peers. And thereby we're reducing their sense of isolation. So maybe they're having the really bad day where the dog runs away from them, but they don't have to feel that they are alone in that process. They don't have to feel as though nobody cares. They can get support and reinforcement from their peers. "Oh man, I had a day like that just the other day. That's a hard one. Do you want to go get a cup of coffee? I'll buy you a new cup of coffee to replace the one that you dropped. Let's go have a conversation." We can also improve the learning dynamics because we can create a space where our neurodivergent learners feel safe to make mistakes. They can feel safe to share their ideas that are maybe 10 steps ahead of everybody else. And instead of ridiculing them, we can create a dynamic where people can say, "That's interesting. I'm not quite following that thought process. Can you walk me through that?" We can also create a dynamic in which we have increased motivation. So if we give them the opportunity to share their viewpoints, they can be really heard and understood. And I think for the most part, that's really what we want as human beings, right? In its most simplest form is to be heard and to be understood and to be seen. And lastly, my hope is that if we implement a framework like this, we can create a sense of acceptance with regard to allowing neurodivergent learners to recognize and leverage the strengths and the unique abilities that they have. And hopefully they will no longer see themselves as deficient or different, but instead they'll see themselves as somebody who has something really valuable and amazing to contribute. Now, there's one final point that I would like to make with you all today, and it's this. I believe that if we can truly support our neurodivergent learners in our classrooms, that we will no longer think of them as deficient or different or other, but instead we will start to see them for what I believe they truly are, which is specialized learners. Learners who have such incredible capacity that we haven't quite tapped into it yet, and we're not really giving them the opportunity to. And I want to share a statistic that I think can reinforce that. 44% of people with autism function at an average or above average IQ level. So as we said before, different doesn't mean deficient. And there's a story that I'd like to share in closing about a young man by the name of Louis Capaldi. How many people have heard of Louis Capaldi? Just a few. Anybody online? A couple people? Okay, we've got some more hands being raised there. Now, I'll share with you the story. So this happened just after the pandemic. Now, for those of you who don't know Louis Capaldi, he is a Scottish singer and songwriter, and he has Tourette's. And he was giving a live concert, and he had an episode of his Tourette's in which he could no longer continue performing. Now, I haven't been to many concerts in my life, but when I hear of somebody not being able to perform at a concert, my mind thinks of people getting irate and throwing things and booing, but that's not what happened in this circumstance. What happened was the people in the audience picked up the lyrics and they started singing his songs back to him. What a beautiful moment of compassion and understanding. Now, I think that there's probably many reasons why that happened, but one of the reasons why I think contributed to that dynamic was because before they ever knew that he had Tourette's, they saw value in him. They saw the value that he brought through his music, rather they heard it. And because they saw him or understood the value that he brought into their lives and into their world, before they saw his condition, they were much more accepting of it. And so I would encourage all of you to think about that notion as we go forth and work towards educating our neurodivergent learners, is not only to understand that there might be supports that they need, but just to see that there is so much remarkable talent and ability that they have. Thank you. I think we have a few moments for questions. Is that, yeah? Okay. Are there any questions? I'll bring up the chat window too.
I have a question, Megan. Can you make any recommendations or suggestions for online faculty and instructional designers to support neurodivergent online learners?
Suggestions with regard to
Instructional design or teaching practices. Just you talked about a lot of things sort of generally. Is there anything specific that comes to mind regarding teaching online?
It's actually really interesting that you say that. I've been working on several different resources in addition to this framework. I've developed a set of instructional standards that I'm currently hoping to share out in the form of a training that people can engage in. I also have a design model that I've developed that will help people walk through that more of that condition-specific process of identifying and providing support for individuals. You know, it's interesting because there's a lot of people who are providing resources, and I haven't had the opportunity to dig into everything that people are looking at. And like I said, you have to be really careful because some information is really good and some information is, you know, lacking in some certain ways. I have heard that University of Central Florida, who Amanda Major, if you don't know her, she's amazing. I believe that her unit has created a resource or a training that people can go through. So that's definitely one that you might take a look at. And I mean, if you do a Google search, there are more and more organizations that are putting training out. So I believe Landmark College has a certificate program that they're offering. And if you don't know Landmark College, they're an institution specifically crafted for supporting neurodivergent learners. It's a really remarkable institution. But then I know that there are other institutions that are also working on resources. So I would say if you do a Google search, you could probably find a number of them. Actually, I think it's UPenn. I saw just released a, or maybe it's been out for a few weeks, but they released a certificate program in neuroscience, and I'm actually really excited and possibly enrolling in that myself.
All right, then one last question, and we'll go to the virtual folks. I wondered if you could say a little bit about your thoughts on UDL.
UDL. So if we go back to the framework, UDL doesn't provide something as comprehensive as this. UDL will give you a large portion of the accessibility, and it will dip into the executive functions. That's largely where I see something like UDL comparing to a framework like this. But the thing that I find most interesting about UDL is that people really view it as this complete solution, that if you implement UDL, you're completely covered. And that's actually not the case. I was in a session just the other day about the new executive orders that are coming out. And there was a woman who put in the chat window, I really don't need to worry about all of this because I implement UDL, so I'm covered. And the response from one of the panelists was, actually, you're not. UDL will only ever get you to a basic level of compliance. That was the quote that the person who was in the, and I forget his name at the moment, I'm so sorry. But the other thing that I would caution people about with UDL is the fact that they do look at it as that checklist. And I know you and I have had these conversations before, that just because somebody is implementing UDL, it doesn't give you that degree of customization and individualized support. So you might be implementing UDL, and yeah, you're covering a lot of bases with UDL, but you're still sort of missing that human element, and there are still going to be needs that are not met because it proposes to be this complete framework. Well, actually, that's not entirely true because UDL has released a statement on their website saying that it's not a complete model yet, which is actually really interesting. It's on their website. If you go out and take a look at it, I would encourage you to do so. But yeah, UDL. And to be perfectly honest, I don't think that UDL ever should be a complete solution, because I think what UDL does really well is it serves as this almost like a foundational piece or like a stepping stone that allows people to make the bridge from not knowing anything about accessibility to here giving them a tool that is very comprehensive that they can use in order to use as a stepping stone to then further their knowledge about accessibility and neurodiversity and many of the other conditions that are supported.
Great, that's great. And for those who may not be familiar with UDL, that stands for Universal Design for Learning. All right, are there any questions from the virtual audience?
There was one question earlier, but it sounds like it was addressed, and then just sounds like there's praise and thanks. Thanks.
Sure.
Any other questions here in the room? Oh, great. Thank you.
Yep.
Earlier, you referenced an article where there was peer rejection experience from neurodivergent students. Do you know of any research that shows online formats experiencing less peer rejection because they have less audio, video experiences, and most of it's in writing?
You actually just asked what my next research paper is going to be. That's actually something. So my research collaborator and I were actually just talking about that a few months ago, and we have the paper that we're currently trying to wrap up now, but that is one of the items on our to-do list because we have not come across that information. But yeah, it's definitely on the radar screen.
Anyone else either online or, oh, Aline is,
Yeah.
got,
So we definitely have one more question, and they're moving, sorry, as we're going. 1 second. There was a question asking about for references to refer to later.
we'll be posting, Megan's slides, and if there's any additional links or resources that, that you want to share, Megan, we can post those, with the recording of this session, at a later time. So it'll be up, as soon as, the event ends and we can recover a little bit from it.
And, and just thank you. And just to add to that, there was also another question in regards to specific online design principles that might be helpful to be included.
So we'll find that University of Florida thing that you, Central Florida that you mentioned, and see if there's anything else that comes to mind. We can share those resources with the materials for this session as well. Anyone else in the room have any questions?
I was actually going to say that I'm currently looking for an institution to partner with, well, partner to some degree in the perspective of I would like to sort of pilot my instructional standards and be able to run that training with an organization free of cost.
That's really cool, Megan. Let's talk about that when we do our networking session. That sounds awesome.
Excellent.
That sounds really, really cool. That would be really fun. And let me know, if there are SUNY campuses that might be interested in participating in such a pilot. Oh, I saw a hand raise.
Excellent.
All right. And John Luck. Awesome. All right. Yeah.
Wonderful.
Send me an email and let me know if you're interested, or we can talk later at the networking session, because that's one of the things I'd like to do is to figure out, are there any partnerships or collaborations that we could identify across institutions, not only within SUNY, but potentially external to SUNY. Very good. Thank you. All right. Who else? Question? Yes.
Thank you, Megan. I have a question because I am a firm believer on what you mentioned about learning and how we're not really ever taught how to learn. So coming from now, we're working in higher ed and working with faculty, is that we weren't taught that either. So what kind of resources or anything would you suggest to refer to so that we can help faculty? Because faculty don't necessarily have this background either, unless you work in, have psychology background and like working with educational psychology. So how do we help our faculty to teach them to teach their students about how to learn properly?
Yeah, a great resource you can leverage is the learning scientists. I don't know if you've heard of them before or not, but they're doing a lot of work very directly with students, which is something that I'm a huge proponent of. I think a lot of times we take this sort of fishbowl notion with our students, like they're in this bowl and we want to observe them and we're almost afraid to engage with them in some respects. And so I love the fact that they are, working one-on-one with students in order to explore different learning principles. But yes, learning scientists is absolutely one of the top recommendations that I would make with regard to that. That's a great starting point.
Hey, it's 10:15, so we're going to say thank you very much to Megan, and thank you. And Megan will be here for the rest of the day. She'll be here with us for lunch and hopefully for dinner. And so if you're interested in talking more with her, please find her and chat with her.